Good afternoon and welcome to the 5th meeting of the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council 8, which I formally declare to be open. Thank you all for being here today. As an administrative note, I ask that everyone turn off their video and microphone unless you're speaking. If you have a question, please use the hand function on Teams and you'll be called on. Today, for the first time in CSRIC 8, you will be presented with reports and vote whether to approve them for referral to the Commission. The first, drafted and prepared by Working Group 1, is a report on security vulnerabilities in HTTP 2. And the second, drafted and prepared by Working Group 5, is a report on recommended best practices to improve communications supply chain security. Both reports address important and timely concerns that affect our nation's communications network. I know that Working Groups 1 and 5 have done a great deal of research and put in hours of time and effort to answer the questions posed by Chairwoman Rosenworcel. I believe these reports reflect that work and look forward to their presentation and discussion. You will also receive updates from the remaining 4 working groups on their progress thus far and plans for upcoming meetings. I now turn the meeting over to your co-chair, Nazrin Rezai of Verizon. Nazrin?
Thank you very much. And before we get started and I officially open Group 1 presentation, I'd like to do a quick roll call. I'll start from the top, and if you're alternating for a member, please let me know. Brandon Abley. Rob.
Yes, I'm here. I was muted, sorry.
Brandon, no problem. Rob Alderfer.
Hello, I'm here.
Colleen Andrews.
I'm here for TIA.
Thank you. Mark Annis.
Mark Annis is here.
Thank you. Mike Barnes. Mike Barnes.
Oh, sorry, Nazrin. Mike is in the other room in a NIST meeting, so he's not on.
Who are you alternating for him?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm co-chair George Woodward. I'll wait until you call on me. But Mike's not here.
Okay. Okay, so it's a no. Michael Bergman. Michael Bergman. Donna Murphy. Donna Murphy. Shirley Bloomfield. Shirley Bloomfield. Mary Boyd.
Yes, ma'am. I'm here. Thank you.
Billy Bob Brown.
Good afternoon, present.
Wade Buckner.
Here.
Thank you. Brian Daly.
Good afternoon, Brian Daly.
Marla Dowell. Marla Dowell. Andrew Droz.
Sorry, Nazrin. Marla is also in the same meeting with Mike, not attending today. No
alternate. Got it. Andrew Droz.
Same group, same meeting. No alternate for Andrew.
Catherine Elkins.
Brian Tegmeyer is her alternate from NHTSA.
Harold Feld.
Here.
Craig Fugate. Sorry. Craig Fugate. Michaela Guhat.
Here.
Guhat? Yeah, here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Martin.
I'm sorry,
Goldberg.
Craig.
Craig is here.
Yes, I'm here.
Very good. Thank you. Martin Goldberg.
Here.
Ben Goldsmith.
Here.
Dana Golub.
I'm here.
Stephen Hayes.
Stephen Hayes, present.
Stephen Hayes, thank you. Mark Hess,
Mark Hess is present.
Craig Hoden,
I'm present.
thank you. Antwain Johnson,
Antoine Johnson is present.
thank you, Antoine. Everett Kanekshi, I apologize.
Everett Kaneshige is here. Thank you.
Javed Khan, Javed Khan, Farouk Khatibi,
Present.
Jason Lish,
This is John Shield for Jason Lish, alternate.
Jennifer Manor,
Present.
Timothy May,
Tim May is present.
Maureen McLaughlin,
Present.
Danny McPherson, William Mikuki,
This is Megan Stapleton. I am the alternate for Bill Nowitzki.
got it. Susan Miller,
Susan Miller's here.
Derek Peterson,
Derek Peterson is here.
Christina Pusak, Mark Reddish,
Hi, Marcus here.
thank you. Travis Reuter,
Travis. Oh, sorry. No, it's right.
Travis is here. Sorry, is that a confirmed yes? I didn't hear that.
Which Travis? Yes, I'm here.
Last name is Reutter.
Yep. Sorry. That's me. I am here.
Very good. So Nasrin is here. John Rose,
Yep, John Rose is here.
Travis Russell,
The other Travis is here.
Oracle.
Yeah.
Very good. Francisco Sanchez.
I'm here.
Very good. Tom Sawanobori.
I'm here. Thank you. CTIA.
Very good. Tim Schramm.
Tim Schramm is present.
Sean Scott.
Hey, Nazarene.
Yes.
Young Kim, alternate for Danny McPherson. I just had audio issues, so I apologize.
I apologize. Which company?
VeriSign.
VeriSign. I gotta go up. Can somebody? Okay, Dan. I'm sorry. What is your name?
Young, Y-O-N-G. Last name is K-I-M. Alternate for Danny McPherson.
Very good. Got it.
Thank you.
Of course. Let me go back. Did we get Christina Pusak? No, I'm down my list. Sean Scott. Paul Steinberg.
All here. Thank you.
Padma Sudarsan.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Peter Tomczak. Peter Tomczak, Tomczak. FirstNet. Claire Vishik. Steve Watkins.
Steve Watkins is present.
Cicely Wolf.
Present.
George Woodward.
George Woodward's here.
Henry Young.
Henry Young's here.
Okay. I already have Drew for Timothy, and I think my list is done.
Hi,
Suzanne,
this is
whether we have quorum.
This is Donna Bethay Murphy. I was having trouble with my audio. I don't know if you can hear me now.
Which company? Tell me again.
In Marset. In Marset.
Sorry, in Marset?
Yes.
Okay, I'll capture that.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, well, it's Maureen McLaughlin. So Brandon Hinton should be joining as he's my alternate. I will have to drop off at some point during the meeting.
I'm sorry, which company is this?
That's fine. That's fine, Nazrin. It doesn't, Maureen's here right now, so, and she has an alternate coming. It's fine. You don't need to note it. And I think that we're only missing 10 members from my count, so I think we have quorum.
Very good. All right, we'll kick it off. So as Suzanne said, we're excited. We have two really good topics for vote today. One is the group number 1, tasked with identifying 5G signaling vulnerability associated with HTTP2 protocol, specifically around what vulnerability exists tied to 5G. And then we know that later on, you guys will come back to us with mitigation. So we do voting on that. And the second group up for vote and discussion is report on recommended best practices on improving communication supply chain. This group is primarily focused on, of course, service provider, cloud providers, and software providers, and framing the challenges and issues and set of recommendations in that space. After each group, I will ask for your votes. So with that, we'll start with group number 1, which is the security vulnerabilities in HTTP2.
Very good. Thank you. This is Brian Daly of AT&T, and on behalf of Travis Russell and myself, I'd like to thank the committee, and we'll be presenting the summary of findings for our first report. So just as a matter of background, what we were tasked with was to examine and address the security vulnerabilities associated with the newly adopted 5G signaling protocol, HTTP2. We also wanted to confirm these vulnerabilities and identify others and provide recommendations on how to remediate the risks associated with HTTP2 and also prevent them from carrying over into HTTP3. Next slide, please. So our objectives, we understand that there are 4 main vulnerabilities that the FCC was aware of and associated attack vectors related to HTTP2. These are slow read attacks, which call on a malicious client to read responses very slowly. Hpac bombs, where malicious archive files designed to crash program or system reading them and often disable antivirus software. Dependency cycle attacks that exploit new flow mechanisms designed to optimize networks and create an infinite loop which cannot be escaped. And stream multiplexing abuse, which uses security flaws in stream multiplexing functionality to crash servers, resulting in a denial of service to legitimate users. And the task was to research these as well as other vulnerabilities and attack vectors that the industry has identified and bring in subject matter experts and working group member expertise to address these. Next slide. Of course, we can't do the work alone. We have an excellent team together. I won't read each of the names, but I'd like to thank all the team members for their contributions and participation in the discussions, and also our FCC liaison for the support that was given by the FCC. The next slide, we also had a number of alternates as subject matter experts that were brought on board in order to discuss this topic. And again, like to thank these alternates for their contributions and participation within the group. If we move to the next slide, please. So just a review of our delivery and schedule. We've had working group meetings bi-weekly to do research and examine the security vulnerabilities and attack vectors. Our report on security vulnerabilities in HTTP2 is presented today for the Council's consideration and vote. And our second report, which will be targeted for June of 2023, will report on the best practices to mitigate the vulnerabilities in HTTP2 as well as HTTP3. Next slide, please. So let me, before I hand it to Travis, I'll just give a quick executive summary of the report. So as we know, 5G is really a departure from traditional wireless networks. It really is the next, not the next evolution of 4G. It's a completely new architecture with new technology, and it's built using IT and cloud technology. The signaling protocol that's used within the 5G core network and other parts of 5G, such as the OSS and BSS systems, is HTTP. The network core uses HTTP2, while some support systems may use HTTP1. And that raises concerns around known vulnerabilities in the HTTP protocol. The FCC, if we move to the next slide, the FCC did ask us to identify any vulnerabilities in the 5G signaling associated with the HTTP protocol specifically. The first deliverable in this report is identifying those vulnerabilities, and the second deliverable, as we mentioned, will report on how to mitigate those vulnerabilities and provide recommendations both to the industry as well as the FCC. And as we move to the next slide, I'd like to turn it over to my co-lead, Travis. So Travis, I'd like to take it over.
Great. Hey, thanks, Brian. So when we looked at HTTP2, first, one of the things that we had to look at, because there are a number of known vulnerabilities in HTTP2. Most all of those, though, are found where a network has public access, for example, connected to the internet, remembering that the HTTP protocol was actually developed for use for accessing website pages. So what we had to look at was the possibility that an exploit that typically could be seen in an open network, how that would be able to be used in a closed network, such as 5G. So we took that into consideration as we examined all of the known vulnerabilities. We also explored some other potential threats that the group identified. And what you're going to find in this report is we'll identify the vulnerabilities that we believe pose a threat to the 5G core networks, rather than all vulnerabilities of HTTP. We looked at existing industry sources. We looked at the input from the FCC. And as Brian mentioned, we had presentations from some subject matter experts. We don't discuss the mitigations here, as we have said. That'll be the next report, which will come in June of next year. Next slide. So there were a number of specifications, white papers that we did take into consideration. This is a listing of those. So we did obviously look at the industry standards, which you see in that first grouping, both from 3GPP and IETF. There were some industry white papers that we also looked into. And then, of course, some claims that were made by researchers, some of those that actually presented to us. So we're very, very grateful, by the way, to all of the SMEs that presented to our working group. Their input was very valuable to us. Next slide. So when we look at the use of HTTP2, first, HTTP2 has really never been used before in a 3GPP standards-based system. When we say 3GPP standards-based, we're talking about cellular networks that are based on the specifications from the 3GPP standards organization. So in the past, the industry has relied on telecom proprietary technology like Signaling System 7, which has been a topic of the CSRIC in the past, diameter, which was used in the 4G networks. But in 5G, the 3GPP specified HTTP2 or later versions to be the signaling protocol of choice for 3GPP systems or any networks based on 3GPP specifications. They also define what's called a service-based architecture, and I'll talk a little bit about what is an SBA and what is an SBA management architecture. I'll talk about that in a minute. The 3GPP specified that HTTP2 is used in both the service-based architecture and the service-based architecture management architecture. Also, the GSMA has specified that HTTP2 is used between two networks to support roaming. That was not specified by 3GPP. They're also in the GSMA specifying that HTTP2 and other parts of the network be used. We've seen instances in the specifications that could allow for earlier versions of HTTP to be used. GSMA is recommending the use of HTTP2. And boy, that's going to be a hard acronym to keep pronouncing as we go. We do know, for example, now in 5G, you're going to start to see phones that no longer have a removable SIM. In fact, I just got one yesterday. It now uses an eSIM, which is built into the device. The management interfaces that are used by the telco to provision those SIMs and manage those SIMs also uses the HTTP2 protocol under the recommendations of GSMA. The ORAN Alliance and other virtual specifications for Open RAN, they may also use HTTP2 for the orchestration and the management interfaces. Next slide, please. So what is a SBA? In previous generations of network, we used a point-to-point architecture between network functions. And so when a phone connected, it connected to a specific application. That application then connected back into the core network to a specific application, a point-to-point. As traffic increased, it always followed the exact same route, going from one network element to the next network element, regardless of what the session was for. As we started looking at the use of IoT and other things within the cellular network, it became obvious that that type of an architecture was not going to work anymore. And the industry needed to move to an architecture that was a lot more manageable than what we had previously, but also was able to support the volume of traffic that was going to be anticipated in 5G. And so the 3GPP defined what's called the service-based architecture. You'll see it in that specification 23501. It does not require every network function being used for every single mobile session. So this is a departure that we have seen from previous generations of wireless. When a session is established with a device, only the services within the core network that are needed to support that session actually get used. And so this is a big departure, and it did require a lot of changes within the network to be able to support that. We do have, on the next slide, I'll show you the illustration that shows that. There is also a new element that was defined in release 16 called the service communication proxy. It's missing from this illustration, but that's going to be a very key role in this SBA architecture, especially when we start looking at mitigation around denial of service attacks. The next slide. So what you see here is a diagram showing what a service-based architecture looks like. And so you have on the left side, that's one network. You have on the other side, that's another network. So two separate networks connected together through this function that you see there in the middle. That's called the SEP. I won't go through what every single one of these functions do, but when, as I said, when the device, which you see here, the UE, when it connects in through the RAN and it gets connected to this user plane function, there's sessions then where it will connect into this core network, and only those functions that are needed for that particular session will get used to support that. So instead of having every single session be routed the same way through the same functions and applications, in the SBA, we only select the functions that are actually needed for that. So big departure from what we have used in the past. And the protocol that is used, of course, to connect in between all of these different network functions is HTTP2. Next slide. There was also a management system for these different networks prior to 5G. And prior to 5G, you had an element manager and you had a network manager. We used a reference point to identify the two different functions and all of the interfaces between them. Starting with 5G, this was really changed a lot to align with this whole service-based architecture. And the end result is what we call the service-based management architecture. Next slide. So you have a couple of different management services that make up this SBMA. It's the configuration of any of the network elements. It's the performance, fault management, and then any new services that are being added in subsequent releases of the specs. 5G is still being defined. We're still seeing new functionality being added into the specifications as we move from release to release. So it's flexible enough that as we add a new service into the SBA, then the SBMA will be able to add those services in. The question? Okay. So each 5G network function, it has its own set of services. This gives the vendors the flexibility to build this SBMA architecture out for their specific products. So you don't have a very specific and rigidized standards as to how this function is going to work for every single network element. There's flexibility in there that the vendors can add for their own products. They may have additional features that they want to provide above and beyond anybody else. And so there's a lot of flexibility here in how the SBMA works. Next slide. When we look at the standardization of HTTP, the 3GPP, of course, did not define the standards for HTTP. IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, is responsible for the HTTP protocol. And if you'll remember, I mean, this is the protocol that was developed for Internet users to access and retrieve website information. So, you know, every time you open up your browser and you go to your bank or you go to some other website, you're using the HTTP protocol to get there. Now, there's been 4 different versions of HTTP since its inception in 1991. HTTP 2 was released in 2015. It was a major revision and it replaced HTTP 1.1. I know I'm going to continue to stumble on that acronym. HTTP 2 is defined in the RFC 7540. Next slide. When we look at HTTP 3, this is still a work in progress. So you know that there are sites, by the way, running today HTTP 3. Not as widespread as HTTP 2, but not in 3GPP yet. The big difference is HTTP 2 runs on the TCP protocol. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with TCP/IP. TCP introduces some latency issues, though. It's a connection-oriented protocol. And so as such, it has some overhead with it, which introduces the latency that we see within signaling. So Google actually defined what I would call an adaptation layer that's called the Quick UDP Internet Connections, or Quick. What it does is it emulates a connection-oriented session, but instead of using TCP, it uses UDP connections. UDP connections are typically best effort. It's a connectionless technology. It's what email and other form factors use for getting across the internet. So very little latency, but the downfall is that it's best effort delivery, which we can't have in a signaling ecosystem. And so Quick was developed to help resolve that issue by providing or emulating some of the features of a connection-oriented type protocol. It's not yet been endorsed by the 3GPP for use within 3GPP networks. There's still some work being done in the IETF. And as that work continues, 3GPP, of course, is monitoring that. And we don't know yet when it or if they will endorse HTTP 3 or not, but that is being tracked. Next slide. So when we look at the HTTP vulnerabilities, like I mentioned, it supports a wide range of applications, included the World Wide Web, Internet, some specialized services. SBA and SBMA is one example of what we would call a specialized service. So while it is possible to use some of the vulnerabilities that we will be talking about that are known vulnerabilities on the Internet, that we have to remember that those vulnerabilities are possible because that network is open. It's on the Internet. And so anybody with access to the Internet can then use those exploits to access a particular location and initiate the exploit. When we have a network that is not connected to the Internet in a closed network, such as 5G, then those attacks are not possible, unless somebody is able to actually compromise the network from within a company's resources. So an insider attack. That would be the only way that somebody would be able to then to get access to somebody using these exploits. So this might be possible, but it's pretty unlikely. And we'll actually provide some recommendations in our next report that will deal with how to prevent these insider threats. Next slide. So the first assumption of the working group 1 is that the 5G core has got a very robust network perimeter defense. It's a closed network, and it only connects to other known 5G networks. And even when it's connecting to those other 5G networks, it is through perimeter defenses. And so actually in 3GPP, there was a function that was defined for exactly that reason. In past CSRICs, when we looked at SS7, we looked at the diameter protocol exploits. Those were possible because we did not have any kind of perimeter defense within the networks. And the 3GPP took that into consideration with 5G. So they have built in a function which is called that SEP, S-E-P-P. That was actually developed as a perimeter defense in response to what we saw with SS7 and diameter capabilities, where somebody could spoof a network and get access to somebody else's network. And the second assumption is that these would be, if there was one of these known vulnerabilities, it would be either a second or subsequent stage in a multi-stage attack. So for example, somebody gets the login credentials to somebody's network. That would be the first phase of an attack, or first stage. And then through that, they're able to then gain access into the 5G network, the SBA, SBMA, as an insider attack. So that would be a subsequent stage. So again, this is something that we'll discuss when we start looking at the mitigation for these, how that you mitigate any kind of an insider attack coming in. Next. The other thing that we saw when we looked at some of these vulnerabilities, we put them into different classifications. And so the first classification I'll talk about, these are client-initiated attacks on servers. And so this type of attack, this is something that is initiated against an HTTP2 client on an HTTP2 server. And that's where the slow read attack, the Hpac bombs, what's called dependency cycle attacks, stream multiplexing attacks. In fact, there was just one of those reported yesterday, not on 5G, but on the Internet. URL prefix injection, and then SBA customer attack. And I'll go through each one of these. So go to the next slide. So what is a slow read attack? This was one of the attacks that was identified by the SEC staff as an example of the vulnerabilities that we looked into. Now, the way this works is an attacker will send a valid HTTP request to the server. The way that the HTTP protocol works, without getting too far down into the weeds, is basically a request to a server, and then the server provides a response. When the attacker gets the response, they're going to read it very, very slowly. This keeps the connection alive so that it doesn't time out. And they continue to send these requests to the server while reading the results very slow. So what ends up happening is the attacked server, they end up with having these resources that are dedicated to that connection. They just eventually get overwhelmed and they get flooded with all these different requests. That then blocks other requests from getting through. And this is, by the way, this is not even addressed by the IETF in the RFC. Next slide. Hpac bombs, this is another one that was identified by the SCC staff. The specification allows a sender to define what the maximum size of what's called the header compression table is going to be for a particular response or request response. It does not restrict what the size of those headers need to be. So an attacker can put in a header field in the HTTP message that's exactly the size of the dynamic header table into the dynamic header table. Then they send that request to expand the header field repeatedly. The attacks quickly then end up with this gigabyte level storage requirement on the target machine. And again, you end up with a DOS attack. Next, please. When we look at dependency cycle attacks, this was also identified by the FCC. The RSC actually allows a stream that will give an explicit dependency on another stream. So this allows the server to prioritize how it's going to handle different streams. That dependency then, it must be a very strict tree. Processing a loop or cycle can cause this unpredictable behavior like infinite loops. And so the result then is a DOS attack on that target server as their resources become exhausted. Next, please. A stream multiplexing attack is one where an HTTP2 stream represents a single request and response cycle. So the attacker will send the request, then they get a response. That's one cycle. Once that cycle is closed, the identifier for that particular stream is not used. It should say used and not sued again over the same connection. So every time a request is sent, it's going to get an identifier. When the response is received, it should have the same identifier so that they can correlate the request with the response. But that identifier, the value of that identifier, should not be reused again over the same connection for a period of time. If the implementation of the protocol stack, and this is, we'll talk a little bit about these implementation vulnerabilities, but if I am building a function and it's going to use the HTTP2 protocol, then I have to put a protocol stack on my server to be able to support that interface. If I don't implement that HTTP2 protocol stack correctly, then I could allow then that vulnerability to be exploited. We did identify this as what we called an implementation vulnerability, which we defined that in section 6.1.7. An implementation vulnerability is one in which a supplier that is implementing the HTTP2 protocol on their product, they don't do it correctly. And in that case, it creates a bug. So those are easily, I won't say easily, but those are resolved through an existing process within the industry for identifying where bugs exist and the supplier then fixing that with a patch for the product. So we do not address the implementation type vulnerabilities because those are already addressed. And in many cases, there would be a fix out before the report would be out. Next slide. Looking at the URL prefix injection, the value of the header is meant to be HTTP or HTTPS, but it will support some arbitrary bytes that get included. Some protocol stacks, again, this is implementation specific, they use this to construct the URL without validating the URL. So this allows attacker to override the path and possibly poison the cache in that particular server, or create a what's called a server side request forgery vulnerability. Again, the RSC allows this, and any supplier that does not validate in their stack, so they're lacking that validation, could possibly allow for this exploit. Again, the 5G implementations are unknown. We don't know where this particular capability would exist within an implementation. So we considered this as a protocol level vulnerability, but we'll talk more about the mitigation that we recommend for this. So it's not really an implementation vulnerability, but it was included in this report for more thorough review and classification on the next report. Next slide. A SBA customer attack. An attacker will compromise or take control over what's called the session management function. So that is a specific function within the 5G service-based architecture, the SMF. That's considered as the consumer. The compromised SMF then will launch a DOS attack against another network function that's called the Universal Data Management UDM function, using the slow read vulnerability that we talked about earlier. This, of course, then your 5G network operations are going to degrade under this attack by this compromised instance within the SMF. In order to get access into the SMF, this requires the other stages that we talked about. So I would first have to launch an attack against the company, or one example of this, there was actually not long ago an attack on a network using email phishing, to where they were able to then plant malware. So the first stage was get the unsuspecting employee to click on a link. Once they clicked on the link, the second stage was to plant malware on that particular person's laptop. Once the malware was there, they were then able to track and steal credentials that they were using to access their network. So in this case, they would use that to access the SMF. So we'll talk in the next report about how you prevent those types of insider attacks, but to be able to launch this directly is highly unlikely. Next. On a heist attack, this is based on vulnerabilities that exist in other protocols and in these implementation shortfalls. So we'll talk more in the final report as to what the mitigation is. It allows the attacker to utilize details of other protocols that might be used and web browser activity, which of course there is no web browser activity in the 5G context. Could also be some issues here with the handling of third-party cookies, which again, this is an internet type of capability. So we don't anticipate seeing this type of an attack in a 5G context, but we're going to look at this in more detail and provide more detail on this in the next report. Next, please. So I talked a little bit about these implementation vulnerabilities. So these are considered as bugs in specific products. It's the poor implementation of a protocol stack which can result in a vulnerability being exploited. Every product, every vendor, they deal with these in different ways. Trying to report on that in this study would be exhaustive. I mean, when we looked at all of the known vulnerabilities that were implementation specific, there are hundreds of them against HTTP2 protocol. And I don't think we were able to find really any that were applicable in a 5G context. So we did look at these. They are tracked through what's called the CVE. They're fixed by each of the individual product suppliers through their patches. And so we deemed this was way outside the scope of Working Group 1. Next slide. So again, the scope of this report, this is the analysis of vulnerabilities relative to HTTP2 in a 5G context. And in our second report, which we've already started, by the way, we'll talk about mitigations and recommendations, both for the industry and the FCC. And the last final thing is there is some opportunity within the network, not within the core network, but in some of the perimeter networks that help support 5G. There is use of HTTP 1.1 that might be allowed in some parts of the ecosystem. There are some known vulnerabilities against HTTP 1.1, and that's why the GSMA, the 3GPP, and other organizations have suggested that only HTTP 2 or later get standardized for all of the 5G signaling. And you'll see more of this in our final report. And I believe that is the last slide. Any questions?
I had one quick one, if I may.
Sure.
Back early on, you mentioned an assumption of physical security or perimeter security. Does that imply anything about, say, an underlying cloud architecture? Does that imply a private cloud, or am I kind of reaching too far here?
No, it's very, very specific to perimeter around the SBC, or I'm sorry, the SBA. However, I mean, yeah, cloud security also, you could go many, many layers, right? But what we focused on specifically was that perimeter around the 5G core network, of which there is a defined function by 3GPP to support that.
Got it. Thank you.
There's actually two. There's the SCPP, and then there's the SCP, which is inside the core. SCPP is used to protect the perimeter. SCP is used to protect against things like denial of service.
Thank you.
I think we have a hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, Harold Feld here. A couple of questions. You reference in a number of places the nature of inside attacks versus outside attacks. What are you considering to be an inside attack, particularly in the network context where there are a number of proprietary networks that are all inside the larger 5G network? And are you classifying the spread from one network to another network as an inside attack or an outside attack?
So when we say outside attack, that would be somebody on the internet being able to get access into a network function within a 5G core network. That would be an example of an outside attack.
Right. So if there's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The inside attack would be somebody gaining access to the resources of a carrier and using that access within their network, whether it be part of their management system or some other capability that the carrier might have, and using that to laterally move into accessing one of the network functions in their network.
But staying within the core network, to take an example, if a T-Mobile network component were compromised,
yeah, it would have had to have been compromised from within that operator's network, right? Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of my interest and concern here is we have, of course, in the PSTN, a number of interconnected networks that are all using different protocols, but with various gateways that allow for the transmission. And part of what was driving my question is if you have there are certain functionalities that are enabled for one network to communicate with another, where you can, of course, therefore also transmit various modes of attack, some of which we might characterize as inside. So again, sort of in my example, if T-Mobile were compromised and then reached out through any of a variety of ways through to the AT&T network. Is that characterized as an inside attack, or are we looking at that as something different? And how realistic? And just to date myself, as somebody who remembers the first internet worm, how realistic is that kind of a scenario in the existing 5G network?
Yeah, so I mean, you could classify it as either, right? You could classify it as it's an inside attack to the ecosystem, but it's an outside attack from that operator-specific network. One of the things that's different in 5G, though, is a lot of that opportunity or a lot of that type of exploit was addressed in the specifications for 5G. And so there's some specific network functions that were put into place to sit between two networks. What we had in the past with the PSTN was you just simply connected your networks. They were considered as trusted networks. And so there really wasn't anything that would protect you from any kind of an attack coming from another network. And there was no authentication that you truly were an approved network. Both of those things got added in 3GPP for 5G.
Thanks. That's exactly what I was trying to get at.
Okay. Anything else?
Final questions for Travis? So what I'd like to do, ask for those who vote yes or any vote no.
Do we want a verbal?
I guess what I would like to know, if there is a no vote for this report, then I'll go through the roll call. Okay. I would say that this particular report, the report on vulnerability, yes?
I'm sorry, this is Suzanne. Excuse me very much. You do need to actually take a vote for everyone to say yes in order for it to technically be voted.
Go through the roll call or people?
No, you can just say, everyone who
say yes.
Approves the appoint, please say aye.
Okay. Everybody who votes for this report, please say yes.
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 Aye.
Yes. Yes. Aye.
Very good. And those who vote no, please say no. All right. So this report report on vulnerabilities in HTTP2 is approved.
Great. Thank you very much, Nazrin.
Of course. And we go to working group 5 now, please.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Nazreen. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present the CSRIC Working Group 5 report today. I am Padma Sudarshan, co-chair of the CSRIC Working Group 5, along with Todd Gibson. Todd and I will jointly provide a readout of the report on the best practices to improve communications supply chain security. Next slide, please. As a background, the core objective of the working group was to review risks to the service provider operations from attacks in the service provider's cloud and software supply chain and develop mitigation strategies for these vulnerabilities. And the FCC had also directed the working group to recommend best practices to mitigate the risks for each vulnerability that was identified. In this readout, we'll go through our analysis, key findings, vulnerabilities identified, and some recommendations, including next steps. Next slide, please. This slide lists the names of the team members that worked on the report. First, I want to thank my co-chair, Todd, for his leadership expertise and for partnering with me in this effort. Our FCC liaison, Saswat, was a great partner, and we would like to thank him for all his support. And Todd and I had the honor of working with a lot of very knowledgeable people. We had an excellent representation in the group that included various agencies, standards bodies, telecommunication service providers, software and cloud vendors, and government groups. And this was quite a big, broad task. And while we spent a fair amount of time as a group, starting with meetings once in 2 weeks, but for the last 2 months, we had to ramp it up to meetings twice a week and numerous additional ad hoc discussions in order to get the report out on time. It was a very collaborative effort with a diverse representation, and we'd like to thank the members of the working group for their efforts and collaborating with us on this report. Next slide, please. And here we have a list of alternates identified to support the working group members if needed, and their names are listed here, and many of them helped us contribute and review the document. Next slide, please. The supply chain vertical is a very broad topic, and it includes both software and hardware. Therefore, the supply chain security report has been broken up into 2 deliverables. The first report is on best practices to improve communication supply chain security, with the primary focus on software supply chain security. And this is being submitted today for full council consideration, and our readout today is mainly on this report. The second report will focus on best practices to improve supply chain security of infrastructure and network management systems. And this report is due June 2023. We are already in the process of kicking off these discussions and plan to continue a bi-weekly engagement towards delivering this report. Next slide, please. So a little bit on the overall structure of the report. Of course, we started off with the executive summary, introducing the topic, our objectives and scope for the first report, and the methodology we used in addressing the topic at hand. Then chapter 4 in the report documents, we did analyze some of the recent software supply chain attacks, the taxonomy of the attacks and the vulnerabilities exposed and what we could have done to prevent, possibly prevent it. And the group then also proceeded to gather and analyze all the current industry and governmental efforts so that we can leverage what's ongoing and also get a full picture of what is the state of the software supply chain security. This analysis is also captured in chapter 5 of the report. In chapter 6, we discussed the changes in the telecommunication deployment paradigm and the ecosystem evolution, which perhaps introduced some new types of security risks in the software supply chain. This final chapter in the report summarizes our findings. We have also identified some key vulnerabilities and clear recommendations with some way forward suggestions. Next slide, please. So some of the, I'll go through some of the key supply chain attacks that were identified. SolarWinds, Kaseya, and Apache 4G are examples of some key attacks or vulnerabilities in the 2020-2022 timeframe, and the group analyzed these 3 breaches in detail. In the case of SolarWinds, their build server was compromised by a state-sponsored threat actor that embedded backdoor code into a legitimate SolarWinds library. This backdoor enabled access into the victim's environment, which they used to load malicious software in both memory and storage, resulting in compromised platform. Apache Log4j flaw was due to a vulnerable open source software that was released into the marketplace. Log4j is sourced from public repositories and embedded into trusted commercial software. The flaw allows an attacker to orchestrate a remote code execution attack through LDAP, for example, which stores user identification passwords and computer accounts. Kaseya VSA was an authentication bypass vulnerability, which allowed attackers to compromise the VSA software and distribute a malicious payload through hosts managed by the VSA software. The malicious payload would then execute a ransomware attack via SQL injection on identified client databases. So the discussions about SolarWinds and Kaseya illustrate cyber attacks on commercial software products and impacts such attacks, and the impacts such attacks can have on downstream customers of these firms. The Apache 4G vulnerability illustrates the risks associated with widespread use of open source software in numerous commercial software products. I mean, these recent breaches have highlighted that threat is pervasive, and the attacks on these operation networks could have significant impact on emergency calls and national security communications. Next slide, please. The group also, once we have documented all the recent attacks and understood these types of attacks, the group then reviewed activities in various standards bodies, governmental agencies, and brought in industry experts to understand the current industry and governmental efforts and to identify potential gaps and what else can be done going forward. Subject matter experts from agencies like NTIA, NIST, CISA, industry standards bodies like ATIS, TIA, GSMA, just to name a few, and other forums presented their existing and ongoing activities in an effort to mitigate software supply chain attacks. The report documents all the research we have done, summarizing key suggestions from each of these organizations and the ongoing activities that are happening in those organizations. And the final vulnerability and mitigation recommendation that is presented in the report is in the final section of the report, and which Todd will go through. And we did leverage the work that is already being done in all these other organizations. Over to you, Todd. I'll let you walk through the remainder of the findings and recommendations.
Sure. Thank you, Padma. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. I'm Todd Gibson from T-Mobile, and like Padma said, co-chair with her. I'll be presenting the findings and recommendations that the work group captured in the report. And so, again, referring to the slide that Padma just came from on the industry and government efforts, the work group really, after they did the analysis, really wanted to capture their own high-level description of of a secure software supply chain, which we state as a set of practices that enable organizations to adjust the way they securely consume proprietary or open source packages, and then both first and third party, from source code to operationalization at a sustained high speed and quality relative to their accepted risk level. Because understandably, the accepted risk level is always key to kind of like what Travis was mentioning earlier about the historically, software developers or software companies will provide, bugs, right? Open bugs, closed bugs, and so forth. So again, it's all based upon that accepted risk level. And then the group also collaborated on a visual graphic that generally highlights the key activities in a software supply chain. So just a very rudimentary, but at least it's a graphic that we put together and use. So next slide. So after reviewing the details related to the recent software supply chain attacks and the current industry government efforts that Padma just referenced, the work groups captured some key findings, and these key findings are categorized and organized into 5 high-level discussion topics. The first is a change in paradigm impacting current software supply chain. The next is modernization of the supply chain. And then in the following slides, we'll also show the lack of a complete and definitive standard in software supply chain, the cybersecurity operations, which primarily focuses on runtime security, and then the last is common best practices for software supply chain. So let's first look at the top bullet here, the change in paradigm impacting current software supply chain. from an industry perspective, right? There's been some technical advancements in the communications service providers networks that include both vertical and horizontal disaggregation of both hardware and software. The prevalent offerings today that you're seeing, right, is software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, communications as a service. And to be clear, these are not all new to the cloud service providers, but they are new in the 5G system. And these capabilities allow for the communication service providers to select the best in breed software, resulting in multi-vendor deployments. Additionally, the adoption of open source software has almost permeated all software code bases that are being delivered to the software consumers. Open source software has proven to be instrumental in accelerating software development and enabling feature velocity. Synopsys published their 2022 open source security and risk analysis report, which shows that much of the open source software being used from the code bases they've audited is not being managed effectively. Synopsys identified that 85% of the code bases that they reviewed contained open source software that was more than 4 years out of date. Additionally, Synopsys reports that 88% of the code bases reviewed utilized open source components that were not the latest version available, which we know that unpatched software is one of the key entry points for cyber attackers. For a communication service provider, this evolution to vertical horizontal disaggregation has materialized into multi-vendor solutions being combined to deliver a network function with each individual vendor using open source software separately and independently. And so, we're not making necessarily a claim that open source software is less secure, but we're just stating the facts that we captured in the findings. And then compare this to the new paradigm, or compare this new paradigm to the legacy model, where a single vendor provides the hardware and the software for a single network function. So today's new software supply chain model has become significantly more complicated. And then on to the next one, the supply chain needs modernization. And so in this one, the industry is rapidly evolving to adapt to newly published software supply chain enhancements that are discussed in the report. But in order to make these published enhancements effective, like for software bill of materials and supply chain risk management, additional enhancements are needed. As a starter, the SBOMs need to be machine readable for scalability and for automating security scanning. Additionally, SBOM enhancements findings include providing end of life and end of support data, right? We all get that, what's the end of life date for that particular software? Do we have that any software running in our networks that's been deemed end of life or end of support? And that needs to be on each software component. Component provenance, a software provenance needs to be provided, as well as the cryptographic protections. And then for supply chain risk management enhancements should include updated public communications timelines for various attacks and events. And so, for instance, China passed the Management of Network Product Security Vulnerabilities law last July 2021, which restricts vendors from making public notifications of newly identified software vulnerabilities until after a mitigating patch has been released. And so this new law will allow adversaries more time to compromise vulnerable platforms prior to the software consumers even becoming aware that the new vulnerability exists. So again, that's a key, topic that, we raised in this one. And then also cloud service providers and software vendors with established CI/CD pipelines, they may have significant challenges generating SBOMs, automating security testing, and communicating those unpatched vulnerabilities at scale, with the software consumers. And additionally, the software consumers, they're having a very, probably very challenged today to evaluate this data in near real time to determine their risk appetite. And so, so again, just more of the findings here. So next slide. And then we'll continue on this one on the lack of a complete and definitive standard supply chain. So the emerging public and private artifacts of guidance, specifications, and/or standards are notable to start with, right? And to, you know, it's very early to see these. I mean, you know, these publications have a lot of merit. Let's say, let's put it like that, and they taken early steps to really get the industry coalescing behind some particular directions. But these that have been released have notable differences that conflicts and creates confusion in the industry. So just one example which highlights this is the difference between TIAs and NTIAs baseline SBOM data fields, as shown in this table. As clearly noted, you know, there's significant delta between them, but there's also some overlap. So again, this is just a key finding that the work group calls out. And again, this will feed into some of the recommendations. So next slide. And then continuing, the work group also identified that the industry needs to evaluate the feasibility of recommendations, including foundational processes like, you know, such as the SBOM minimum data field, software identification tags, and SBOM automation and consumption automation. The next is risk management processes, which include software provenance authority, software author supplier identity, and author supplier reputation. You know, today software developers can publish software anonymously on the internet through these hosted repositories. Likewise, certain suppliers, so software vendors, let's say, may not be vetting their developers adequately. And so, you know, just as we all leverage online reviews today, and maybe even like the Better Business Bureau reports before we go hire an auto mechanic or necessarily a roofer, we should have that same vetting capability in the independent software developer and software supplier space. And then the next one is vulnerability management processes, such as software chain of custody, vulnerability and exposure disclosure, unpatched vulnerabilities, and then software immutability. And again, and I bring this up because I'm repeating it, but just as the industry has used those software release notes for decades to disclose patched and unpatched bugs, disclosing unpatched vulnerabilities will be critical to allow the software consumer to make those risk-based decisions on that software before it's introduced into a production environment. So next slide. Now on to cybersecurity operations. So once the software package is delivered by a vendor and operating in a service provider's network, the security monitoring and detection of anomalous activities is critical. Right, I think we all know that. The software vendor is the most familiar with their code base, their execution calls, and their compute resource activities. Runtime security is an emerging security capability that enhances the security monitoring on the platforms and applications. So in this case, we show RASP as well as CWPP, which are just two examples of this. But the work group believes that runtime security could have been very crucial security capability that may have alerted the software consumers to those recent software supply chains attacks discussed earlier, like SolarWinds and Cassia, let's say. And so, you know, just important to call out. And then lastly, the work group thought it would be beneficial to call out several common best practices for software supply chain security. You know, it's always good to repeat these as a reminder to further ingrain this in the industry, so it becomes more muscle memory for everybody. And sometimes, we can very easily take some of this for granted, but we need to ensure that our developers are adequately trained. Software composition analysis needs to be mandatory. It needs to be a mandatory activity on all free and open source FOSS software. And then continue to advance your security scanning capabilities. And then also with outsourced software, that software should be just as secure as in-house developed software. And then credential management is critical. Next slide. And so now we get to the summary of the recommendations, which is really the key deliverable for the work group. So the work group developed a comprehensive list of recommendations based upon identified vulnerabilities. Again, we were chartered by the chairwoman to look at the software supply chain space, identify vulnerabilities, and then generate recommendations based upon those recommendations. And so we also used the recent cyber software supply chain attacks and the efforts in the industry. And the work group captured a number of vulnerabilities as requested by the chairwoman. And again, for each identified vulnerability, the work group identified a recommendation to mitigate that vulnerability. And then some of these are not novel, but it is worth repeating to ingrain the importance of these recommendations into the mindsets of the developers and the various organizations. And so first, we listed out some general guidance for the organization, such as SBOMs, such as organizations that are providing solutions directly and or indirectly to the U.S. government should be aware that SBOMs may become a mandatory requirement going forward, and such should prepare now to address this ask. Additionally, organizations should start taking proactive steps to prepare themselves to build SBOM awareness and understand what SBOM support means, identify how to produce, consume, and share SBOM data, including how to improve tooling and processes. Again, it's a lot has to go in to those particular functions. And I think, organizations, collectively the work group thinks organizations need to start preparing on that. And so therefore the general guidance was provided. And so now with the identified vulnerabilities, I'm not going to list those vulnerabilities specifically. They're detailed in the report, but the work group develops recommendations, the vulnerabilities and the correlating recommendations, and align them to 5 distinct groupings, which are secure development, free and open source software, cyber and supply chain risk management and processes, cybersecurity operations, and then standardization opportunities. And then we used our industry and industry experience and knowledge to apply a best practice tier assignment. And we went from 1 to 3 for each vulnerability, with tier 1 being the most critical. And the tiering is only meant to help organizations, both large and small, to identify and prioritize the critical vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. And then, so all in all, the work group identified 19 unique vulnerabilities and 59 recommendations to mitigate those vulnerabilities. And again, these specific vulnerabilities and recommendations are captured in the report in detail, not in this executive summary presentation. So next slide. The work group collectively wanted to make other recommendations for the commission that were kind of outside the vulnerabilities and recommendations. First, the commission can assist providers of all sizes with software and with the software and cloud services supply chain security by offering those resources to increase providers' awareness of software and cloud services supply chain risk and describing methods of enhancing software supply chain security. Next, the commission could engage with CISA and NIST to support an effort to create universal standards and specifications for supply chain security, and to support the standardization of SBOM formats, uses, and deployments. And just this past week, CISA Executive Assistant Director Eric Goldstein commented that the federal government is trying to drive the adoption of SBOM and strong security as defined by NIST Software Security Development Framework, which this reinforces really what the work group's recommendation is to the commission. And then lastly, the work group recommends to the commission that a broader study on open source software be conducted. Various reports have stated that open source software is just as secure as in-house developed software. And there was no real argument or disagreement collectively amongst the work group of that. But the Synopsys 2022 report identifies that open source software is not being well managed and thus could be a pathway for adversaries and future attacks. And then next slide. And so this is the last slide. This concludes our presentation on the report that the work group published. Hopefully the council has had an opportunity to review the report in detail. Again, I want to thank, just like Padma did, the work group for all their efforts. I also want to thank Padma being my co-chair for her support and leadership. And as always, Saswat was a great partner for Padma, because Padma and I, we went from being members to interim co-chairs to full co-chairs. So either way, it was great. And now we'd be happy to field any questions that anybody may have on the report.
I have a question.
Hey, Harold.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Synopsys report. Was there any comparison made between the maintenance of proprietary software versus the maintenance of open source software?
Collectively, I don't know how we would actually get that type of data, considering the fact that the proprietary in-house developed software is done through their own release cycles and sprints. They do it through their own roadmaps and their feature development, processes where they'll put their features on a roadmap. So they typically, like I think even what Travis mentioned, they have their bugs that they go back and they'll identify new bugs in their software, and some could be vulnerabilities, and then they'll work those into some future release cycles to get mitigated. Yeah. So I don't know how we could get that data publicly, right? That's the thing. But we did have the open source data from Synopsys, which was very objective collectively from the work group.
Right. I just want to clarify though, because there's often, or I have encountered prejudice against open source on security vulnerability concern. Somebody's got an echo.
Yep. If you're not speaking, can you mute, please? Mute check. Thank you.
I just want to clarify. So it could be that software, general upkeep of software and software management could be a broader problem, not related to the nature of whether it's open source or whether it's proprietary. It's simply that the data is available for open source to conduct the study.
Yep. And I will say too, I mean, it's a fair point, but we did also call out that, the communications of new vulnerabilities should be communicated sooner rather than later. And we compared that to the Chinese law that was passed last year. So again, particularly when critical software vulnerabilities are identified, that should become public domain knowledge as quickly as possible. Very similar to what Alibaba did with Log4j, and got the industry all moving and took away a lot of holiday schedules for people last year, right? But it gave people opportunities to go address those new published vulnerabilities in whatever fashion they choose, right? Whether it could be they could firewall it, block it, turn the application down, let's say, worst case, but trying to do a collective comparative report on in-house proprietary software and use that comparatively against the Synopsys report. I don't think anybody's seen anything comparative like that available on the internet, either for sale or free. So. All right, thanks, Harold. Travis, I see your hands raised.
Yeah, sure. So back on slide 48, you talk about software author supplier identity, author supplier reputation. Any thoughts from the group as to how you accomplish that on open source where you may never know who the author is?
So, so that's part of a challenge. I know there's a lot of discussion and some internal debate on how we could enforce it and do it. There's a lot of ideas bantered around on some methods that could be used. I think there's still a lot more research that has to go into that, and that was part of the recommendations. The other recommendations to the commission to maybe potentially, they could engage with NIST and CISA to help drive some of that stuff from a global perspective. It's one of the scenarios we talked about, and I know I brought it up, is that somebody could go out there and say a nation state or whoever it may be, some known hacker group, right, with a lot of capabilities, and they could go out there and create, hey, I'm John Doe, and I created this software, and I go upload it to one of the main internet repositories for open source software under an alias, and I can say I'm John Doe, where I could, and then it could have some malicious software embedded in it, and then they could go do their automation engines and bots and go download that software, a million times and give it a 5-star rating, let's say, or a 4.5 star rating, make it look a little bit legitimate, but somebody could come along, and I'm not going to lie, I've been guilty of this myself, about 10, 15 years ago, where I went to one of these and I'm like, hey, that's the feature that I need. It's on one of these open source repositories. It's got X number of downloads, right? It wouldn't have that many downloads if it wasn't reliable, right? And so people download it. So it all comes back into how do we get that ability to identify and authenticate who that developer is, and also have some kind of reputation score. And that goes for the software vendor as well, because some software vendors may have a really bad track record of having some really bad software that has a lot of identified vulnerabilities post-release. So,
thank you.
You're welcome. Hey, Harold.
Yeah, another question. Did the working group consider what steps the commission itself could take to foster movement on these recommendations, or was that considered out of scope of the working group?
It was considered out of scope. We were the charter from the chairwoman was pretty clear. Identify the vulnerabilities and publish recommendations, and so that's what we did. And so what they do beyond that is out of scope for us.
But a future recommendation from the FCC might be to consider how the commission itself could facilitate these recommendations.
Yep. I mean, this isn't the first CSRIC series, so I would defer that to our liaison, Saswat, or Suzanne or Kira on that, on answering that question. I don't think us as chairs can answer that.
Thanks.
Any other questions? All right, great. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks for your time again.
All right, so I'll ask for votes. Those who vote yes, please say yes.
Yes.
I'm going to vote yes, but I just want to highlight the points that I made, particularly with regard to the fact that we don't have a really good comparison between the open source software management and proprietary software management.
Okay, thanks, Harold. Ask for those who vote no. All right, so basically the recommended best practices to improve communication supply chain security is approved. Next
you,
agenda
everybody.
item, please.
Great, thank you very much. If we would like to move now to the updates from the remaining 4 working groups. Corinne, do you want to move the slides forward, please?
Is it moving?
Yep, you ready to
Yes.
go? Okay, great. Working group 2.
Thanks. It's George Woodward, co-chair, Working Group 2. In a nutshell, we are on track. We are actually at NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology in Boulder, Colorado, for our second in-person, face-to-face meeting. We are crunching through the final acceptance and editing process of our report, and I'm happy to say that we are on track. Any questions? And Zenji, that jumped us all the way through all of my slides. Or Kirian.
Great. Does anyone have any questions? George, that was great.
Much quicker than the first 2 presentations, I might add.
Right.
But
So you
they
just
were-
don't
they
you
were-
don't have any updates. There's nothing's changed in your plans for your upcoming report.
No updates, no changes whatsoever. We are absolutely on track to our deliverable, and no changes in our status.
Great. Does anyone have any questions? If not, we can move on to working group 3. Thanks.
John, would you like to do a quick one, or should?
Yeah, in the spirit of the previous, we'll skip the slides. We're on track. The documents are progressing. One item, there are some intersections with working group 2 on threat lists that we work through. So we have some interdependencies, but those are all being managed. So yeah, no real changes, on track.
Great. And so are the 2 working groups together, 2 and 3? I know you all are out in Colorado.
No, we weren't. We couldn't get enough physical attendance in Boulder, so we did a virtual meeting today, and then we're setting up an interlock on the threat list. We're just decided to coordinate that, so George will be reaching out to you to get that set up.
Oh, great.
Yes.
So George, it's just you all who are out there.
Yes, it's just working group 2. And yes, Suzanne, the plan originally was a joint 2 and 3, but that's we're working that change. We're managing that change.
That's great. And I think the other working group co-chairs just take note of the fact that both working group 2 and working group 3 have had now 1 and 2 in-person meetings. I think if you had any questions, any of the co-chairs of those 2 working groups could probably talk you through how things went and how they organized it and how much of a benefit there was. I'm under the impression there was a great deal of benefit, but of course that is up to each individual set of co-chairs. But thank you very much. Thank you, John. So do we then, if anyone has any questions for John, then let's move on to working group 5. No, sorry, 4, Mary, working group 4.
Good afternoon, everyone. George and John have set a entire new standard for update reports. So I will follow their lead in terms of updates for working group 1. Carrie, and if you'll just run to the next slide. As a reminder to the team, we are focused on 911 over Wi-Fi, and we are in full steam ahead. Let's go over to the objectives for just quickly as a reminder and for our guest who may be online with us. We are to look at the technical feasibility, the public safety benefits, and the cost elements for ensuring voice over Wi-Fi is enabled and properly routed with a 911 environment into the correct public safety agency. Next slide, please. I'll go quickly. We are a team of 53 strong between members and alternates. Next slide. And with the support of Rasul from the commission, we are a very strong and mighty team. I just want to recognize Mark Reddish, who is co-chair with me on this initiative. He is a pleasure to work with and a very strong co-lead. So I want to do a shout out for him. Next slide, please. Our deliverables are on schedule as reported by our other two working groups. We meet weekly in some capacity, either through the tech feasibility, public safety, or the general working group. The cost sub-team has not started yet, but due to the close alignment with the other two sub-teams, we will begin our work quickly on that. And at this point, we are still on target for March the 23rd with our full report. Next slide, Kurian. Here's just a sample of the framework. We do have a draft report in the works. We have looked at the framework, the analysis, the heavy lift for our work group right now are all the various use cases that can go on in a 911 over Wi-Fi environment. We are working through sort of what would be normal today, and then we're going to advance into the environments that are really not developed yet. That's our next big lift in this initiative, and then making our recommendations. Next slide, please. And we will continue in our next steps. We will continue our work. We are considering an in-person meeting. If we cannot pull that off with the tech teams, we will probably develop another sub-team that will be meeting weekly as well to work on some more of the advanced technology discussions. So with that, this ends our report. Mark, did I leave anything out that you would like to add?
Oh, well done. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you for allowing us to report.
Does anyone have any questions for Mary?
Thank you, Suzanne.
Sure. Then I guess we can move on to working group 6.
Make sure there was a question, Suzanne. One question.
Hey, this is Tom Swinburne. Mary and Mark, thanks for your work. I had a question about the scope of it. Maybe you covered it, but is it to cover like routing of 911 over Wi-Fi, call completion over Wi-Fi, and location as well? What's kind of the scope of your efforts?
Yeah, Tom, I'm sorry. I quick speed read. Yes, that is within our scope. Is correct routing. It's location delivery based on the devices that are capable of doing it. I've lost count, Tom, on the number of use cases that incorporate all of these aspects. We also have a list from the public safety benefits sub-team as to what public safety would need in a 911 call coming to them over a Wi-Fi network. So we are looking at what would commonly be seen in a wireless world or a VoIP world for call delivery. We are applying that to Wi-Fi.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Sorry about that, Tom. I didn't see the hand up. Anyone else? Okay, thank you very much. And we can now move on to working group 6.
Thank you, Suzanne. Following the example of previous one, I will be brief and focus on the changes. The working group is being chaired by Francisco Sanchez and myself. So in the way of background, we are looking at the wireless system and how we can use some of the capabilities that are in the wireless system to enhance wireless emergency alerts, or WIA. And specifically, we are looking at how to improve the the utility of VIA as well as accessibility to individuals with access and functional needs. Next slide, please. So here's a picture that of a mobile device that instead of just giving you a text message with what the wireless alert VIA alert is, we can potentially present a picture of the map where the alert area is and where your device is, where you are, so that you can make the decision more intelligently. And this can be done through things like application programming interfaces, APIs, and other aspects, and that's the scope of our work. Next slide, please. So again, focusing on what are the major changes since our last report, and I've highlighted those in red. So originally we had one report due March of 2023, but at the request of FCC, we have agreed to provide an additional report on VIA performance reporting due December of 2022, and I will go a little bit more detail about what that is about in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So the next two slides talk about all the great members that we have that are very active and providing excellent contributions. So we truly appreciate, and as always, without the members providing, the work progress would not happen. So next slide, please. And these are obviously the alternate members that have been extremely helpful. Next slide, please. So, obviously the working group membership has been finalized for a while. We switched from bi-weekly meeting to weekly meeting. So now we have weekly meeting, and as we get closer to the deadline, we may actually have more than that. But right now we are at the weekly meeting, and the concept of maybe having a face-to-face meeting that intrigues me. So I would bring that up with the working group. And obviously we are using Athis workspace. It's been extremely helpful, and we appreciate Athis that allowed us to do so. Next slide, please. So as far as the status, this is the status of the overall working group. We have done some studies on APIs. We have looked at a number of use cases and categorized them from those that can be supported with the existing VIA parameters. Some of them may need enhancement to existing VIA parameters or changes to it, and some of them may require major changes. So we are categorizing based on those, how much of impact on the parameters would have. And some of them may have, I think many of them would have standard policy and or legislative changes. So we are going to explain all those in our report. And there may be even some use cases that are outside Working Group 6 existing scope, but we will include them regardless, but we will make sure that it's identified that it's outside the scope. Next slide, please. So this is what I was talking about. This is the new report at the request of FCC. Working Group 6 has agreed to create a new accelerated, one of the use cases on VIA performance reporting, and create an additional report due December of this year. This is in support of an FMPRM that FCC has out, and there were a lot of comments that the work that Working Group 6 in CSRIC 8 is doing is relevant. So we decided this is a good way to gather all that information and help FCC make the right decision. So I think that is the last, maybe the next slide. So this is the last slide. We will continue our weekly conference call and develop recommendations, and we are working on our 2 draft reports, and they are pretty much on time. Thank you. With that, I will see, Susan, back to you to see if there are any questions or comments.
Great, thanks. Does anyone have any questions? All right. Well then, Billy Bob, would you like to address the council?
Thanks. I would just like to continue to congratulate everyone in their efforts and the dedicated work that's been done so far. The great reports that were submitted and voted on today is a testament of the real contribution by all the members and the subject matter experts and all of the various working groups. I do want to challenge you all to continue that work, and I appreciate all of the efforts that you all are doing on behalf of national security.
Thank you. I agree. And I would like to express the Commission's thanks for your referral of the report on security vulnerabilities in HTTP2 and the report on recommended best practices to improve communications supply chain security. We appreciate the expertise and the effort that you all put into this work and look forward to utilizing these reports to support the FCC's mission and to providing leadership and strengthening the defense of the nation's communications infrastructure. Thank you all. The next meeting will be held on December 15th at 1, and it will be in person. I look forward to seeing many of you. We will, of course, also have a call-in option for those of you who are not able to join us. In advance of the December meeting, you will be receiving 3 reports. From Working Group 2, there will be a report on challenges to the development of ORAN technology and recommendations on how to overcome them. From Working Group 3, we will receive a report on how virtualization technologies can be used to promote 5G security and reliability. And from Working Group 6, as noted, there has been an additional report added to the schedule, and that is a report on WEA performance reporting. You will have 2 weeks prior to the vote at the December 15th meeting to review these reports. And if you have any questions or concerns, you will then receive instructions to reach out to the working group co-chairs to discuss. Again, thank you all very much. I think this was a very productive meeting. And with that, I announce the 5th meeting of CSRIC 8 is officially closed.
Thanks, Suzanne.